Okay, good afternoon, everybody. First, I would like to thank the organizers for putting this wonderful panel together. I'd also like to acknowledge my presence as a non-native person on the traditional lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. I also want to acknowledge that I currently reside on the lands of the Miccosukee and Seminole communities. So my talk today engages the politics of care in Canada's public apologies to Nikkei and Aboriginal communities. On September 22nd, 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney issued a formal apology on behalf of Parliament to those of Japanese ancestry interned in Canada during World War II. In addition to parliamentary recognition, Mulroney agreed to a settlement with the Japanese Canadian community and provided a monetary compensation to the survivors of internment, to the Japanese Canadian community as a whole, and to a newly set up Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which seeks to, quote, foster racial harmony and help fight against racism, end quote. Spearheaded by the efforts of second and third generation Japanese Canadians and headed by the National Association of Japanese Canadians, or the NAJC, President Art Mickey, this formal agreement was, according to NAJC legal representative Marika Amatsu, 4 long years in the making. 20 years later, on June 11th, 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper's House of Commons apology to Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples for residential schools was announced. The apology emerged from the 2006 Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. The agreement provided compensation that was divided into different components, including monetary compensation for students and funds allocated to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and events. As the largest class action suit in Canada, this agreement was a culmination of court cases against the government, which sought not to close, but open up the reckoning with Canada's settler colonial past and present, particularly through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Is everybody hearing me okay? Okay, thank you. So recent scholarship has begun the process of examining these two public apologies in relationship to one another as a means of tracing the intersecting racial and colonial logics structuring Canada's contemporary policies. In their edited collection, Reconciling Canada, Jennifer Henderson and Pauline Wakeham read these two apologies amidst a proliferation of state gestures of repentance as inconsistent and staggered maneuvers by a variety of state actors that nevertheless have worked to form themselves into a coherent national narrative. The apologies, which emerge out of the movements for redress and reconciliation, can thus be seen as central to the contemporary image production of Canada as a reformed and renewed nation. While many have deemed these enactments of contrition as watershed moments that attest to national progress, others have explored how the apologies work to re-narrate the past and to overwrite the endurance of colonial and racial policies in the liberal multicultural present. For example, in an interview, Roy Mickey laments the 1988 apology, which constitutes a loss for the Nikkei community insofar as the nation state, quote, strengthened itself by taking ownership of redress, end quote, and re-narrating it within the official history of Canada. With regards to Indigenous peoples, Glenn Couthard notes that this, quote, industry of apology, end quote, initially emerged out of states that were in transition from openly authoritarian regimes to more democratic forms of rule. For Couthard, implementing practices of transitional justice in settler states, such as Canada, has the effect of eliding the continuing structure of coloniality. As such, in his words, reconciliation takes on a temporal character, as the individuals and collective process of overcoming the subsequent legacies of past abuse and not the colonial abusive structure itself. For Sarah Ahmed, this national narrative of progress is galvanized through the cultivation of national shame during the public the public performances of the apologies. She argues that shame offers a temporary affective staging for the reconsolidation and reaffirmation of national love, and for this instance, right, the love of Canada as a nation. She writes, quote, "Exposing the failure of the ideal is politically important and part of what shame can do and has done, but it could also become the grounds for declarations of love that are patriotic. In such declarations of love, shame becomes a passing phase in the movement towards being as nation, where the ideals that the nation has are transformed into what it does," end quote. So in my paper today, I wanted to provide a comparative reading of Mulroney's 1988 public apology alongside Harper's 2008 apology. And just to sort of be clear, again, the 1988 apology is the apology for Nikkei internment, and the 2008 apology is the apology for Aboriginal residential schools. And I'm going to just call them by their years, so 1988 and 2008. So reading these public apologies and as an affective impetus towards moving the settler state into this being as nation, I argue that a comparative reading of these apologies reveal that such national affective movements are staggered and unevenly projected onto communities that are differently positioned in relationship to the state. So the Japanese Canadian community and the Aboriginal communities differently positioned in the Canadian state. In particular, the two apologies conjure emotions which work in mutual constitution to cultivate what I consider settler racial structures of feeling. This is a phrase that I reformulated from Mark Rifkin's notion of settler structures of feeling. In order to highlight how the racialization of non-native peoples centrally operate in settler colonial processes and vice versa. I use the term settler racial to identify the relational movements of racialization, imperialism, and settlement, and the role of settler, alien, and native within such processes. This descriptor centers the braided processes of settlement and racialization in the context of the Americas as distinct and yet interconnected. At the same time, settler racial also speaks to the connection and imminent breakdown under which non-native racialized people can reproduce and benefit from the processes of settlement. Settler racial structures of feeling, for me, identify a settler racial common sense that is internally contingent upon the containment of Asian and Aboriginal affective formations in the midst of the culture of redress. So Mark Rifkin argues that settler common sense comprises, quote, the quotidian ways of reproducing the givenness of settler jurisdiction, placemaking, and personhood, end quote. He suggests that such common sense may not reference Indigenous peoples explicitly, but its formation is contingent upon Indigenous dispossession and concomitant discursive erasures. So expanding on Rifkin's theorization, I argue that these public apologies reveal a settler racial common sense in crisis, so much so that Indigenous and racialized peoples emerge in a central and embodied way as the very condition of possibility for the enactment of Canadian settler racial reformation. In my juxtaposition of Mulroney's and Harper's apologies, I contend that their invocation of a specific emotion, their invocation of this emotion or feeling of burden, engages settler racial structures of feeling that unevenly work to compel and thus contain these two communities' healings through the terms and the directionality of the state. This narrative works to produce community sentiments sanctioned by Canadian multicultural policies, all the while working to foreclose other transformative feelings and collectivities that are in formation at this point during the cultures of redress. So when examining the 1988 and 2008 apologies, we can see critical convergences and divergences in the ways that the state engages Nikkei and Aboriginal peoples. Most visibly, the 1988 and the 2008 apology both employ narratives of progress that unevenly strive to register Nikkei internment and Indian residential schools into the past tense of Canadian history, and to mark the apology as inaugurating the future potential of the Canadian state. The 2008 apology does so immediately by stating that, quote, the treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history, end quote. Here, the grammatically marked national narrative is distilled into a banal metaphor of a book whose shameful chapter has been written, elided, and can ultimately inscribed into the past tense. While the 1988 apology does not recite this specific metaphor, reports after the redress announcements were made revealed similar sentiments. For example, Sergio Marchi, the Liberal Party's multiculturalism critic, was documented as congratulating Mulroney, Art Mickey, and the NAJC for closing, quote, the chapter of what was a very sad and sensitive history, memory in history. So again, sort of this invocation of this being a sad chapter that's been written and can be closed now. When read comparatively, the apologies work to induct Japanese Canadians and Aboriginal peoples unevenly and contradictorily into the future tense of Canada. In the 1988 apology, the imperative to forget the injuries of the past is promised through the inclusion of Japanese Canadians into the multicultural present of the Canadian state. The apology hails the children of Canadian government with the children of those interned into forgetting and forgiving the crimes of the past, quote, so that they can walk together in this country, burdened neither by the wrongs nor the grievances of previous generations, end quote. Only in forgetting and forgiving can the promise of a multicultural Canada be fulfilled. The future which inaugurates Japanese Canadians into the imperatives of Canada, however, tread upon erasures beyond that of trauma and violence of internment, an internment which is subsumed to the mistakes of the past. It is not simply the clearing of history operative in the apology, but simultaneously in the clearing of land. For in the 1988 public apology, Canada is deemed the land of abundance. Such a phrasing evokes the terra nullius paradigm that structures the conditions of possibilities in the reconstruction of settler colonial states. In evoking the land of abundance, the public apology conjures its erasures of Aboriginal presences. So this erasure is repeated as Mulroney proclaims Canada's, quote, solemn commitment and undertaking to Canadians of every origin that such violations will never again in this country be countenanced or repeated, end quote. However, when we read that quote in relationship to the belated 2008 apology for Indian residential schools, this 1988 promise that the violations would never be committed again is an empty one. At the very least, and rendered preemptive as a continuation of Indian residential schools until the mid-1990s has revealed. So the 2008 apology operates differently than the 1998 apology, not only because of the different community being addressed, but also in the spatial temporality through which Aboriginal peoples are situated in relationship to the social tense of Canada. The narrative of the future potentiality of Canada, promised through the possibilities of multicultural inclusion, is less overtly conveyed in the 2008 apology. In the 2008 apology, the state elides the ongoing structure of settler coloniality by suggesting Aboriginal struggles emerge solely from the effects originating in the event of harm produced by residential schools. While Harper admits that the violence of the past reverberates in the present, the implication that the continuing problems in Indigenous communities stems primarily from this particular imposition further erases the present modalities connected to the structure of coloniality. Harper proclaims that this policy has had a lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language. He maintains that, quote, the legacy of Indian residential schools has contributed to social problems that continue to exist in many communities today, end quote. So these apologies, repeated citations of emotions, in particular the state's implicit citation of this notion of burden, suggests affect's critical relation to the activation of the future-oriented settler national narrative. They infer that the clearing of the violent past hinges also on the clearing of the felt life worlds that sustain such structures of violence. In her exploration on the temporal architecture of shame performed during the public apology, Sarah Ahmed argues that, quote, the desire that is expressed is the desire to move on, where what is shameful is either identified as a past or located in the present only as an absence, the shame of the absence of shame, end quote. As with shame, the citation of burden in the 1988 and the 2008 apologies also contain temporal architectures, whether in and of themselves or through grammatical sleights of hand, that propel Canada towards its being as nation. Examining how burden is asymmetrically cited between the two apologies revealed the different ways in which these two communities occupy the condition of possibility for Canadian settler state reformation. So just kind of a quick summary, right? Both apologies cite the language of burden. And what I'm arguing specifically here is that in citing the language of burden, the prime ministers who invoke these apologies, perform these apologies, are trying to create a collective feeling across differently positioned communities. But what I'm arguing here is that burden is registered very differently across these two apologies. And because they are registered differently and sort of invoked differently, it reveals how Japanese Canadians versus Aboriginal communities are kind of thought of in relationship to how the Canadian state could perpetuate itself as a colonial state. So the apology for Nikkei internment registers burden as a negative affect, one that must be expunged in order that the future potential of the nation can be actuated. So burden carries a temporal, often generational valence that can reverberate with no end in sight. So the 1988 apology operates as a performance of the end to such a burden, remarking that such negative feeling must be stopped in order that progress can be made for the children of Canada. In the place of burden is this expression of tolerance. So Mulroney declares, quote, we are tolerant people who live in freedom in a land of abundance. Interestingly, both burden and toleration express a carrying on of a negative weight for the settler state. What is inferred in the transition from burden to toleration in the 1988 address is the removal of the burden of Canada's violent past towards a toleration for Canada's Japanese Canadian community, right? So that is, the apology discursively absolves the responsibility the nation has towards its own violent legal and juridical actions and re-emphasizes the Japanese Canadian presence as one to be tolerated. So the 2008 apology changes its tune in relationship to the burden of the nation's past actions. Whereas the 1988 apology absolves Canada's children from the burden of its past violent policies, the 2008 apology expressly takes on this burden with diligence. Harper proclaims, quote, the burden of this experience has been on your shoulders for far too long. And he's talking specifically to Aboriginal communities here. The burden is properly ours as a government and as a country, end quote. Harper incites Canadian citizens to feel burden, to carry this with them as a structure of feeling in the reformation of the settler state. Burden in this case, however, invokes imperialist fantasies of the white man's burden, as popularized by Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, the United States and the Philippine Island in 1899, end quote. Read in this light, the burden that is taken on registers as a continual emotional investment in, not the end to, colonial encroachment. For in the same vein as Kipling's reformulation and justification of colonial encroachment in the Philippines as a spiritual and religious service to the natives, the apology recast its burden of accounting for its crimes towards Aboriginal peoples by turning to an emphasis on its service to Canada's natives. This spiritual imperative is emphasized by Harper's closing address. Quote, God bless all of you, God bless our land, end quote. In addition to its spiritual undercurrent, Harper's apology employs pseudoscientific language to encourage this march towards the future potential of the nation. That is, the apology assigns the survivor and the perpetrator into two roles, that of the patient and that of the doctor, respectively. What becomes implied in this categorization is that full reconciliation between Aboriginal and settler Canadian peoples is contingent on these figures' fulfillment of such assigned roles. Residential school survivors are represented as feeling too much, while the apologetic nation is configured as solemn, self-reflexive, and made available to help. This can be seen in Harper's most direct apology in the address, where he repeatedly hails Canada's recognition. So the word actually recognition gets repeated over and over again and applied to the Canadian nation. And he repeatedly hails Canada's recognition of Aboriginal people's suffering. And suffering, again, gets repeated over and over again in the apology as well. This repetition of the thinking state and the feeling native subject accentuates Canadian settler reformation as contingent on resolving the excess of Aboriginal feelings through settler-prescribed healing. In Therapeutic Nations by Diane Million, Million argues that the discourses of healing draws from settler states' moves to elide consideration of self-determination towards, quote, state-determined biopolitical program. In the apology, the state is largely positioned as objective, the state's recognition implicating a sense of recognizing, right, thinking, whereby Canadian settlers are compelled to feel insofar as they can feel for Aboriginal people, such as through the reconfiguration of settler colonial burden. So I have a couple of things I wanted to say by way of conclusion. The first I want to talk about is that I want to conjure this idea, right, that coloniality operates not as an event, but as a structure, and that gets kind of continually talked about through Patrick Wolf. In the same vein, these two public apologies are a part of a constellation of legal juridical maneuvers, symbolic gestures, public and private events that maintain the structure of settler racial rule. So while the public apologies enunciate settler racial structures of feeling at the juncture, at this liberal multicultural juncture, these affective formations are nourished and sustained through different apparatuses that constitute a multitude of means towards redress and reconciliation. So with this in mind, I want to talk specifically about the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, or the CRRF, and Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, which we had talked about yesterday as well. I see them as co-constitutive of the public apologies themselves. So both of these projects, as part of the redress package for Nikkei internment and residential schools respectively, work to encourage and redirect affects and emotions that seem to spill over, form in excess to, over and against the emotions hailed in the public apologies. The CRRF and the TRC extend these uneven affective formations even as they also record their critical ruptures. Whereas the public apology is rife with an excess of emotions in order to compel the nation towards eliminating the burden of the past and urging tolerance as the affective inheritance of the nation, the CRR Act and the CRRF annual report is dominated by bureaucratic language. So the language of facts, numbers, and logistics. This shift suggests that the maintenance of tolerance as a prevailing structure of feeling requires that those implicated in the harms of the past must evolve into an objective stance with which to encounter the problem of race in Canada. Thus, the affective logic suggests that to maintain the being as nation so recently achieved in Nikkei redress is to cleanse the subjective self. This bureaucratic language and the emergence of the objective citizen emerges in dialogic over and against other affective formations and emotions that can be read also in these reports. So I read the annual reports of the CRRF, and really what I saw dominating it was really numbers, facts, objective language, but there were moments where there were citations of other emotions, right, at play, feelings of something not right about what's going on in the government. So in contrast to the CRRF report, the TRC Commission and its summary report places feelings at the forefront of the reverberating work of reconciliation in the aftermath of the public apology. The report, released in the middle of 2015, marked both the culmination of TRC events and a reflection of the uneven, often contradictory, and complex process of reconciliation as a part and parcel of Canadian settler reformation. As the summary report to the TRC Commission activities cites at multiple times, quote, as important as Canada's apology was, it did not simply mark a closure of the past, it also created an opening for Canadians to begin a national dialogue about restoring Aboriginal peoples to a just and rightful place within Canada, end quote. While the report asserts a different functionality from, indeed even seems to critique the 2008 public apology, it continues to uphold a future-oriented narrative of settler national reformation that is contingent upon the language of state care and Aboriginal healing. As Diane Million states, quote, truth commissions operate within an economy of crisis, disclosure, and catharsis, end quote. This temporally structured imperative is manifest, for example, in the report's framing of residential schooling as a lapse in the promise of Aboriginal and Canadian relations, a promise that emerged during the first settler contact. So moments and remarks within the annual reports and the TRC report, however, reveal the continual rupturing of this imperative and thus instantiates the staggered constitution of Canadian settler racial reformation. The CRRF and the TRC events reveal how Canada's narrative of itself as the leader of forgiveness is an imminently undone, unfinished project that perpetually strives and yet unavoidably fails to fully compel communities into these narratives of wholeness and healing. So the settler state's instabilities and failures thus invoke possibilities, I say, for the transformative decolonizing collectivities and solidarities, which I feel we see today in this room. Thank you.